If tomato sauce is a staple in your pantry, you may want to consider canning it yourself. Canning tomato sauce can be very simple, or it can be a little more complex, just depending on the consistency of the sauce that you're looking for. Today, we're going to do a very simple process. We're not removing the skins, we're not removing the seeds, but you can absolutely do that if that's important to you. You may want to score the tomatoes and blanch them to help remove those skins, or you may want to run the sauce after it's cooked down a little bit through a food mill to remove any of that extra skins or seeds. Again, today we're gonna keep it simple and we're going to cook it all down with the skins and the seeds. When you're water bath canning tomato sauce, it's really important to make sure that you're choosing tomatoes that have a pH of 4.6 or lower. The lower the pH, that means the higher the acidity and the safer it is to water bath can it. A few different tomatoes that you could choose from would be either Roma tomatoes, Amish Paste, or San Marzano. Any of those options are great for tomato sauce. There are some other options out there as well, but you again would want to check to make sure that you have the correct pH before water bath canning versus pressure canning. All right, let's get started. The first thing you want to do is rinse your tomatoes. Remove the stem end and cut the tomatoes into large chunks. Now we're going to go ahead and place those tomatoes into a large pot and bring it to a boil. You'll need to stir this occasionally to make sure that the tomatoes are not sticking to the bottom of the pot. Now we're going to allow these tomatoes to cook down to your desired consistency. The longer that you allow this to cook or simmer, the thicker the sauce is going to be. And it's really entirely up to you how thick you want that sauce to be or how runny you want it to be. And just keep in mind that this process can take several hours, again, depending on how thick you want that sauce. Generally, if you cook this down by a third, you're going to have a little bit more runnier sauce than you would if you were to cook this down by half to produce a thicker sauce. When the tomatoes are almost done cooking down, you want to go ahead and start heating up your water bath canner. You'll fill the water bath canner and bring it to a boil. You can even add just a splash of white vinegar in there, distilled white vinegar, and that will help to keep any water spots from collecting on the outside of your jars. We'll go ahead and place a rack in the pan as well, and then we can go ahead and start putting our jars in there. And what we're doing is we're actually just heating up the jars. We're going to process these long enough in the water bath canner that you don't have to worry about sterilizing them, but we do want to heat them up because as we pour the sauce into those jars, we don't want them to crack if the jars are cold and the sauce is hot. While the jars are warming up, we can go ahead and remove the tomatoes from the heat. And using an immersion blender, we're going to blend the tomatoes to break down the skins and puree any of the remaining chunks. Of course, there are still going to be seeds in there, but using this immersion blender really helps to break up the skins, which is nice. Next, empty the water out of the jars and remove the jars from the water bath canner. If you're unsure of the pH on the tomatoes that you're canning or you just want to play it safe, I would go ahead and add in 1 to 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, or you could do half a teaspoon of citric acid per quart jar or a 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid per pint jar. Next, we'll add in a 1/4 teaspoon of canning salt to each of the jars, and you could even put in a couple fresh basil leaves if you want to add some extra flavor. Next, we'll go ahead and fill each of these jars with the tomato sauce, making sure that we leave a 1/4 inch of headspace. Now we're going to go ahead and find a rubber spatula or a debubbler tool, and we want to dip that into each of the jars and try to bring any bubbles up to the surface if there are any. This is going to be much more important if you have a very thick sauce versus a runny sauce. The thicker the sauce, the more likely there is to be air bubbles that are trapped in there. At this point, you can go ahead and double check your headspace on each of these jars if it looks like maybe they might be a little bit lower now that you've released some of those air bubbles. And if so, go ahead and top those jars off with a little bit more tomato sauce and making sure that they have that 1/4 inch of headspace. Be sure to wipe the rim of those jars with a paper towel that's been dipped in distilled white vinegar, and that will help to remove any chunks off the surface and allow those lids to seal properly. Center the lids on top of the jars, and then go ahead and put the bands on, and you want to twist those on until they're finger tight. You don't want to crank them really hard or keep them too loose. Go ahead and place your filled jars into the water bath canner, and we're going to go ahead and boil these. These are quarts, so we're going to boil them for 40 minutes. If you're doing pints, you'll want to boil them for 35 minutes. After the processing time is up, you can go ahead and turn off the heat and remove those jars from your water bath canner. It's best to put them on a towel rather than directly on the cold countertop. And we're going to let these cool for about 12 to 24 hours. After the jars have cooled, you can go ahead and clean off the jars. You can rinse them if you need to or wipe them down. We want to remove the bands and then label each of these jars with what it is that we're canning, and then of course the date, so we have that for reference. After you have cleaned up the jars and labeled them, you can go ahead and store them in a cool, dark place for up to 1 year. That's it, there's not much to it. Canning tomato sauce can be very simple. Of course, it does take some time to cook down those tomatoes, but other than that, it was not complicated at all. I hope that you have an opportunity to try out this recipe, and if you have any questions, drop them down in the comments. Thank you.